At the end of the last set of slides, we'd noted that the bourgeois system is unsustainable. We see why that is when we examine the proletariat and the conditions in which its members find themselves. Marx begins this part of Section 1 by noting, not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield these weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. We've already seen that the proletariat are the laboring class. They're the people who must sell their labor in order to survive. Unlike the bourgeoisie, they do not own private property in any meaningful sense. They own no capital. We'll go into capital in more detail in the next set of slides. The proletariat are able to find work only if their labor will provide value to their employer. That is, they're able to find work only if their labor is likely to increase capital. Their labor, and thus they themselves, become commodities, subject to market forces. Essentially, they're bought and sold. They try to sell their labor to the highest bidder, while employers such as factory owners seek to purchase labor at the lowest possible price. What does labor look like in such a marketplace? According to Marx, owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. If you've worked in a factory, you'll know that factory work can be very monotonous. When the factory relies on machines, there's often very little skill involved. Instead of having to know how to make a product from start to finish and being able to take pride in one's workmanship, all one really needs to do is learn how to operate a machine, and often just one function of that machine. The result is that not only does work lose its charm, wages go down. Marx says, the worker becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. That is the logic of the factory system. It drives down the cost of labor while making that very same labor more onerous, more burdensome. It gets worse. As work is increasingly mechanized, it requires less skill and physical strength to do. The result is that both age and sex, or at least physical strength, matter less than they once did. So women and children are also part of the proletariat. They also become laborers. An increased supply of workers is, of course, likely to drive wages down. Moreover, the middle class gets squeezed out. Marx notes, the lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. Think about what happens to mom and pop shops in small towns when a big box store moves in. They simply can't compete, and all too often they have to close. That's a big piece of what's going on here. As more and more people are pushed into the proletariat, and as they come into increased contact with one another due to increasing urbanization, they'll become increasingly aware of their plight and begin to develop what Marx calls class consciousness. They'll realize that the problems that beset them aren't just individual problems, but problems that confront them as a class. Class antagonisms aren't new, but the difficulty this proletarian class consciousness poses for the bourgeoisie is serious, and is in large part the result of ever-decreasing wages and the corresponding ever-decreasing standard of living. Marx says in the last 2 paragraphs of Section 1, and I admit this passage is long, but it's worth hearing in its entirety. It's important. He says, "Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can at least continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Okay. As I said, that's long. What that boils down to is the very way the capitalist system, the bourgeois system, is set up, drives wages down for an increasingly large proportion of the population, makes their living conditions untenable, and eventually something has to give. In the final set of slides on Marx, we'll turn to Section 2. While most of that section of the Manifesto focuses on practical considerations, we'll also look at one final point of theory that appears in that section, and that's the idea of capital, which we've already seen is pretty important. So we will explain it in more detail in the next set of slides.